Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. If you've ever, looked closely at the profile of a major city, maybe even the one you are living in right now, you're probably expected to tell you a single cohesive story.
Oh, absolutely. We really like our cities to fit neatly into little boxes.
Right. You read the news, you check the census data, and you just decide, oh, okay, this is a booming tech hub.
Yeah.
Or this is a struggling Rust Belt town. We just crave that clean narrative.
It's a totally natural human tendency, honestly. We want to define places geographically and economically in really binary terms. It just makes the world feel predictable.
Yeah, but then imagine you step off a plane or you drive into a place like Durham, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And suddenly that neat little narrative you built in your head just completely falls apart.
Oh, Durham is fascinating because you are looking at a landscape that is intensely paradoxical.
To put it simply, you've got immense wealth and deep poverty literally sharing a zip code. It's wild.
It is. It's one of the most striking examples of a fractured civic identity you can find anywhere. To really understand what's happening there, you have to look through two completely different lenses simultaneously.
Okay, let's look through the first lens. You have Durham's reputation as the city of medicine.
Yeah.
And, this isn't just some marketing slogan.
No, not at all. You are looking at a place with incredible proximity to Research Triangle Park. We're talking about the largest research park in the entire world.
Exactly. And you've got Duke University anchoring the landscape right there. Historically, Durham has actively jostled for the title of having the highest number of PhDs per capita in the United States.
Right. So if you are just looking at that one data point, you're picturing this utopia of intellectual and medical wealth. It sounds perfect.
But then you pick up a second lens. If you walk just a few miles away from those state-of-the-art medical facilities, the scenery changes drastically.
It's a night and day difference. You see neighborhoods that have been historically crippled by incredibly high dropout rates.
Yeah, and you see towering crime statistics and extreme systemic child poverty. You have these massive gaps between the people curing rare diseases and the people struggling to afford a meal.
Which seem like completely unbridgeable gaps.
And that profound gap is exactly why we're taking a deep dive today into the history of the Durham Rescue Mission.
Yeah, using Andrea Higgins' incredibly detailed book, A Step of Faith, as our roadmap for this.
Because the big question for anyone living in a divided community isn't just how a city gets this way. It's how you actually start putting the pieces back together.
Right. When massive, well-funded government programs fail to fix the blight, you have to ask what actually works.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is the core mission of this deep dive. We are examining a literal masterclass in grassroots intervention today.
We really are. We want to figure out how a very specific blend of unwavering conviction and frankly, radical empathy, managed to alter the trajectory of a broken community.
Especially when all the traditional bureaucratic systems fell so short. But to really grasp how this organization pulled off what looks like the impossible, we can't just look at their massive campus today.
No, we have to rewind the tape quite a bit.
We need to go back to the exact moment this whole thing started. Because if you were going to pick the absolute worst possible time in modern American history to start a charity,
oh, man.
Right. A charity that relies entirely on the generosity of strangers, you would absolutely pick November 1974.
Without a doubt. If you want to understand the resilience of the Durham Rescue Mission, you must first understand the absolute crucible of 1974.
Let's paint the picture for everyone listening. Think about the psychological state of the country back then.
The Watergate scandal had just completely eroded the American public's trust in institutions. I mean, nobody believed leadership anymore.
And on top of that, you have skyrocketing interest rates and massive sweeping layoffs across multiple industries.
And hanging over all of this, like this huge dark cloud, is the OPEC oil embargo.
Which is huge. Now, if you didn't live through it, or, haven't studied it recently, the oil embargo wasn't just some minor inconvenience. It was a full-blown panic.
Global fuel supplies were essentially choked off completely.
Yeah, the cost of absolute everything from heating a home to shipping a loaf of bread shot through the roof.
Exactly. And let's think about the mechanics of charitable giving for a second.
Right, because when you ask people to donate money, you are heavily relying on their sense of economic security.
Precisely. If a family is terrified that the breadwinner is going to be laid off next week and inflation is rapidly eating their savings.
And they're spending their weekends waiting in 3-hour lines just to get a heavily rationed gallon of gasoline.
Yeah, they do not open their checkbooks in that scenario. especially not for a brand new, unproven homeless shelter with zero track record.
So, enter Ernie and Gail Mills, this young couple who decides, against all financial logic, to launch the Durham Rescue Mission right in the teeth of this economic nightmare.
It's wild to even think about.
I try to put myself in their shoes, and it's like trying to launch a fragile tech startup during the 2008 financial crash. But worse, because you don't even have venture capital.
Right, you are entirely dependent on people's spare change.
How did they not just immediately go bankrupt?
Well, it came down to a wild combination of relentless persistence and what the text describes as a string of almost inexplicable interventions.
Or, depending on your worldview, divine providence.
Exactly. The best example of this is the heating oil crisis they faced right out of the gate.
Right, because they were moving into this big facility in Durham, and winter's coming fast. They have to heat the building.
But the global supply is completely squelched. No oil distributors are taking on new customers at all.
Think about it from a business perspective. If you are an oil man in 1974, your supply is literally liquid gold.
You are going to prioritize your oldest, most reliable, highest-paying corporate clients. You are definitely not going to risk your precious, limited inventory on a startup homeless shelter.
A shelter with absolutely no credit history, no less. I mean, if I'm a business owner, I'm laughing them out of my office. It makes zero sense to take them on.
It makes absolutely no sense. But Ernie Mills manages to find one man, a local distributor named Don Christian.
And for reasons that completely defy the brutal economic logic of the time, Don Christian agrees to take the mission on as a customer.
He essentially throws them a lifeline that keeps their doors open and their residents from literally freezing to death.
And the follow-up to that story is wild. The author of our source text, Andrea Higgins, details this moment years later while they are actively writing the book.
Yeah, Ernie insists that Don Christian's name has to be included in the manuscript to honor that 1974 lifeline.
Yes, and the very next day after Ernie instructs Higgins to put the name in the book, a man walks into the mission totally unannounced.
It's Don Christian's son, Steve.
He tells Ernie that his family has been quietly watching the mission's incredible progress over the decades, and he just hands Ernie a check for $5,000.
That timing is crazy. It really defies statistical probability.
Higgins actually notes in the text that she frequently found herself playfully accusing Ernie of making these stories up.
Because the synchronicities are just that extreme. But it perfectly illustrates the razor-thin margins they were operating on back then.
But you know, the OPEC crisis was a macroeconomic storm. Durham had its own highly localized microstorm raging at the exact same time.
Yeah, it was nicknamed the Bull City. And in the mid-70s, it was staggering under the weight of a massive influx of returning Vietnam veterans.
And we really have to be careful not to view 1970s veterans through a modern lens here.
Right. Today, we have a robust, though still imperfect, vocabulary for trauma. We understand what PTSD is.
But back then, post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't even an official diagnosis in the psychological manuals yet.
So you have a local VA hospital flooded with men carrying deep, complex, invisible wounds that society simply does not know how to handle.
Which inevitably leads to a massive wave of self-medication.
Precisely. You have an unequipped medical system, which leads directly to skyrocketing local addiction rates.
And simultaneously, local neighborhoods are physically deteriorating. The text highlights a specific area ironically named Few Gardens.
Ironically named why?
Because it was originally conceived as this lofty, hopeful public housing project. But by the 70s, it was descending into severe poverty.
Right. Marijuana and cocaine were heavily infiltrating the area, creating an underground economy that really fueled violent crimes.
So the Mills aren't just fighting inflation. They're dropping themselves right into the middle of a deeply traumatized, heavily armed, and chemically dependent community.
This sets up what has to be the most intense, chilling anecdote in the entire book.
Oh, the Passover riots. It perfectly captures the absolute tension in the air.
This is a foundational moment for the mission's identity. There is a night in Durham of intense, widespread urban unrest.
A severe racial riot breaks out. The city is literally on fire.
You have vandals and rioters moving aggressively through the streets, looting businesses, smashing windows, setting buildings ablaze.
And the Durham Rescue Mission's building is sitting directly in the path of this chaos.
If you are listening to this, try to picture the sensory overload of that night. The heat of the fires down the block, the sound of sirens, the breaking glass.
And the detail that the source text includes here is the kind of thing that just makes the hair on your arms stand up.
Oh, definitely. On the very night this massive riot breaks out, there was a guest preacher speaking in the mission's chapel.
And he was preaching from the book of Exodus, specifically Exodus 12:13.
Right. For those who might not know the biblical context, that is the story of the original Passover.
It's the moment where God tells Moses that the Israelites who paint the doorposts of their homes will have those homes spared from destruction.
While ruin falls on the rest of the land, it's a heavy, deeply prophetic text to be reading while a city burns outside your windows.
And what happens next is visually stunning. The rioters tear down the street. They set fire to the buildings on the left side of the mission.
And they set fire to the buildings on the right side of the mission.
But the mission itself,
completely untouched, it stood as a literal island of refuge in a sea of fire.
how do you even explain that? Do we look at that as a profound religious miracle? Or is there some kind of sociological explanation? Like, did the rioters intentionally bypass it?
It's a really fascinating debate. If you view it through a secular sociological lens, you could argue that even in the heat of a riot, the community recognized the mission as a neutral zone of help.
They recognized that the mills were actually serving the neighborhood, not extracting from it.
Exactly. But whether you call it a miracle or a sociological anomaly, the practical result was identical. It permanently cemented the mission's presence in Durham.
During an era characterized by urban flight, where businesses and charities were abandoning city centers for the safety of the suburbs, the mills proved they were not going to run.
They planted their flag right in the ashes.
But this brings up a huge question for me. Who actually takes on a challenge like this?
That's the million-dollar question.
If you were to ask me to write a job description for someone capable of navigating an oil embargo, building a massive nonprofit, and surviving urban riots, I'm writing down some heavy requirements.
Like what?
Must have an MBA from Harvard, must have a PhD in public policy, must have 20 years of high-level government administration experience. I'm expecting a flawlessly polished, hyper-academic leader.
And that is exactly what makes Ernie Mills such a compelling figure, because he is the absolute antithesis of that archetype.
He does not fit your job description at all.
Not even a little. In fact, he openly admits in the text, quote, "I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer."
Which is such a refreshing thing for a founder to admit. But what does that actually mean? Was he just being falsely modest?
No, he was being entirely literal about his academic struggles. Initially, Ernie attended Bob Jones University, and the academic pressure completely crushed him.
He bluntly states that he was failing more grades than he was passing.
Right. The traditional, rigorous classroom environment just did not work for his brain at all.
So wait, the guy who was actively failing out of college ends up building an incredibly complex, multi-million-dollar social safety net that outperforms government programs.
It sounds impossible, right?
How does that even work? Does that mean our traditional metrics for leadership are just completely wrong?
It doesn't mean they are wrong, but it highlights a massive blind spot in how we view competency.
Okay, what's the blind spot?
It showcases the difference between academic intelligence and what we might call operational empathy. Because Ernie couldn't handle traditional academia, he made a pivot.
He transferred to the Institute for Christian Service.
Yes, this was a program that stripped away the heavy theoretical debates and focused on a highly practical, hands-on application of theology.
He basically traded the chalkboard for the sidewalk.
Exactly. And what is brilliant here is that his perceived weakness, his lack of academic polish, and his history of failure became his single greatest asset when building the mission.
Because it made him approachable.
Because it completely stripped away the elitism. Imagine you are a Vietnam veteran dealing with severe heroin addiction, or a man who has lost his family and his home.
The last thing you want is some guy with 3 Ivy League degrees looking down his nose at you.
Right. Analyzing you like a bug under a microscope and using clinical jargon to describe your pain. You just don't want to be a case study.
Exactly. But Ernie didn't speak from a pedestal. He sat across from deeply broken people and was authentically humble.
He knew what it felt like to fail, to feel inadequate, to be told he wasn't smart enough.
That shared vulnerability builds instant, unbreakable trust with populations that have been chronically analyzed and rejected by traditional institutional systems.
It's like finding a doctor who has actually survived the disease you are fighting. You just naturally trust them more.
And during this formative time, Ernie was heavily influenced by a specific piece of literature. It wasn't a textbook on social work.
No, it was an 1896 novel called In His Steps by Charles Monroe Sheldon.
That book is incredibly famous in religious circles for popularizing the question, what would Jesus do?
The plot revolves around characters who decide to dedicate themselves entirely at great personal cost to serving the poor and marginalized.
Ernie read that, and he didn't view it as a nice theoretical exercise. He absorbed it as a strict operational mandate for his life.
But he didn't execute this mandate alone. Every great dreamer needs an operator.
And the sources are incredibly clear that we cannot talk about the success of the Durham Rescue Mission without talking about Gail Mills.
Absolutely. The residents affectionately refer to them as Pop and Mama Mills.
Ernie himself is really quick to point out that the mission is as much her creation as it is his.
He describes himself as the dreamer, the guy with his head in the clouds, envisioning these massive, ambitious projects to help the broken.
While Gail is the anchor, she's the practical operator who figures out the actual granular day-to-day logistics.
Keeping the lights on, keeping the staff organized, and making the dream function in reality. It is a perfectly symbiotic leadership model.
If the story stopped there, it would be a nice, heartwarming tale of humble people doing good work.
But what happens next is what elevates this from a nice charity to a profound sociological experiment.
Because Ernie realizes something that most leaders never admit. He realizes that despite all his empathy and despite his academic struggles, there is still a massive experiential gap between him and the people sleeping in his shelter.
It's the critical difference between sympathy and empathy. You can feel a deep, genuine sympathy for a man shivering in the cold.
You can give him a blanket.
But until you are the one freezing, until your stomach is cramping from hunger, you don't truly understand the immediate, desperate priorities of his existence. You are still just guessing.
And Ernie decided he was done guessing. He realized he had never actually had to beg for a meal. He had never been without a bed.
So he decides to conduct a radical social experiment. He goes to Washington, D.C.
It is a stunning commitment to research. Ernie, along with a staff member named Jack Booth, travels to D.C. for a week of intentional, completely unshielded homelessness.
And they do not do this halfway. They don't have a hotel room waiting for them if things get too tough.
No, they completely divest themselves. If you were listening, imagine doing this. You fly to a major, unfamiliar city. You leave your wallet behind.
You leave all your cash, your credit cards, and your identification. You don't bring a watch.
Ernie even took off his wedding ring before he hit the streets, specifically so he wouldn't become a target for muggers.
They drop into Washington, D.C., with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs.
Their first challenge happens the exact moment they arrive. They're at the metro station, and they have to immediately start panhandling just to get enough change for the subway fare to get into the city center.
Which is terrifying, and there's a fascinating media angle to this, too.
Oh, right. A local CBS affiliate back in North Carolina, WRAL, actually caught wind of this experiment before Ernie left.
Now, Ernie refused to do an on-camera interview beforehand because he knew if his face was on the news, it would blow his cover in D.C.
But he agreed to a compromise. He allowed the TV crew to trail him and Jack from a distance, and they wore hidden wireless microphones.
WRL eventually turned this footage into a 2-night television series on the evening news.
The archival value of that footage is incredible. It provides an unfiltered look at urban homelessness in that era.
But the true value of the DC experiment wasn't the television ratings. It was the deep psychological toll it took on Ernie.
And how that trauma permanently altered the DNA of the Durham Rescue Mission. I want to dig into that psychological toll.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Because obviously they were cold, obviously they were hungry. But when Ernie gets back, his main takeaway isn't just about food or shelter. He talks about something much deeper.
He talks about indignity.
Unpack what he meant by that. What does indignity actually feel like on the street?
Indignity in this context is the sudden, jarring realization that you have ceased to be a human being in the eyes of the general public.
When Ernie was navigating the National Mall, looking for a place to sleep, asking strangers for spare change, he really felt the shift.
When you are homeless, you become an obstacle. You are a nuisance to be stepped over, or worse, you become completely invisible.
People physically avert their eyes when they walk past you.
Yes. The tone of voice people use when they are forced to speak to you changes. It becomes clipped, dismissive, or openly hostile.
Ernie felt that marginalization in his bones. He experienced the soul-crushing weight of being treated as less than human.
And that generated an absolute non-negotiable operational mandate the minute he returned to Durham.
What was the mandate?
He dictated that every single staff member at the Durham Rescue Mission, regardless of their role, must treat every single guest who walks through the doors with profound, unwavering respect.
That is such a crucial pivot. because it completely shifts the power dynamic.
It moves the organization away from this toxic mindset of, we are the morally superior saviors bestowing our charity upon you lowly victims.
And shifts it to, we are peers. We are equals. We see your humanity, and we are offering you dignity.
And that foundation of dignity is not just a nice feel-good sentiment. It is the absolute structural prerequisite for the next phase of their work.
Because you cannot ask a severely addicted person to undertake the incredibly hard, painful, terrifying work of recovery if you haven't first convinced them that their life is fundamentally valuable.
If they feel like garbage, they won't fight for themselves. Respect is the primer for rehabilitation.
So if restoring dignity was the foundation Ernie laid after his time on the streets, what did the actual house look like once it was built?
The daily mechanics of it?
Yeah, let's move into how they actually restore these broken lives day to day. I want to talk about their flagship recovery initiative, the Victory Program.
The Victory Program is their 12-month intensive addiction recovery curriculum for men.
And the very first thing you notice when you look at the syllabus is the intense, almost military-level discipline required of the residents.
It is extremely structured.
Yeah, I'm looking at the daily schedule they enforce, and honestly, it exhausts me just reading it.
Breakfast is at 6 a.m. sharp.
Bible study starts at 6:30 a.m. From 7 to 8 a.m., you're doing personal chores.
Then you sit through 4 straight hours of classes.
Then lunch. And the entire afternoon is dedicated to work assignments around the mission campus. Every single minute of the day is accounted for. Why so rigid?
To understand the why, you really have to understand the neurological and psychological reality of severe addiction.
Think about what a life consumed by substance abuse looks like. It is entirely dictated by chaos.
Exactly. The addict's brain is singularly focused on the unpredictable pursuit of the next high. There is no concept of a future.
There's no such thing as a 5-year plan. There's only the next 5 hours.
Circadian rhythms are completely destroyed. They sleep during the day. They roam at night. Their internal clock is just shattered.
So the chaos isn't just behavioral, it's biological.
Yes, so when a man enters the Victory Program, his brain is physically incapable of generating internal order.
The mission schedule acts as an external exoskeleton for their life.
By forcing them to wake up at the exact same time, eat at the exact same time, and work at the exact same time, the mission is imposing the rhythm that the addict's brain desperately needs but cannot produce.
It's literally shrinking their world down to manageable, predictable, bite-sized steps.
You don't have to worry about fixing your whole life today. You just have to worry about making your bed at 7 a.m.
It restores a sense of agency. It proves to them daily that they can complete tasks and exert control over their environment.
But the schedule is only half the battle. The content of those morning classes is heavily focused on deep psychological and emotional counseling.
And the sources are very clear that this counseling is strictly, unapologetically biblical.
Right. We have a very direct quote here from Dr. Sal Nolfo, who oversees much of the counseling wing.
He says that straying from the track of the Bible leads to a bumpy road where you might, in his words, crash and burn.
The Durham Rescue Mission does not view itself as a secular clinical facility. Their philosophy is deeply rooted in the belief that true, lasting transformation cannot just be behavioral modification.
You can't just teach someone to resist a craving. They believe in the necessity of spiritual regeneration.
The Reverend Rob Tart, the chief operating officer, makes a fascinating point about this.
He says they actually step back and allow the Word of God to affect the changes in the residents' hearts.
Because they view addiction as a symptom, not the core disease.
The disease, in their view, is deep emotional trauma, childhood abuse, profound abandonment, a total lack of self-worth.
They believe that addressing those foundational wounds through a biblical framework of forgiveness, grace, and divine purpose is what creates the metamorphosis we talked about earlier.
Okay, I track with the emotional and spiritual rebuilding. But here's where I have to push back a little.
Sure.
You can give a guy all the counseling in the world. You can give him a perfect sleep schedule. But eventually, month 13 rolls around.
He has to leave the campus.
Right. He has to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a massive 5-year gap on your resume and a felony drug conviction, the corporate world does not care how good your morning routine is. They aren't hiring you.
You have hit on the exact flaw that dooms so many traditional rehabilitation models.
They heal the person, but they fail to reintegrate them into the economy.
And this is where the Durham Rescue Mission deploys what might be their most brilliant operational strategy. It's a program called Temps to the Rescue.
I read about this and my jaw just dropped. It completely flips the employment model. Explain how it works.
Temps to the Rescue is an intermediary economic program. The mission actively places graduates of the Victory program into jobs with local employers in Durham.
But here is the genius part. The resident doesn't technically work for the employer. The Durham Rescue Mission acts as the employer of record.
Wait, so the mission is legally the employer, meaning the mission handles all the payroll taxes and the workers' compensation insurance and all the corporate liability. That sounds like financial suicide. Why on earth would a charity take on the massive corporate liability of hiring recovering addicts?
Because it is the only way to overcome employer risk aversion. Put yourself in the shoes of a local business owner or an HR director.
You need to hire warehouse workers. You have a stack of resumes. You see a guy with a criminal record and a history of severe addiction.
Your immediate thought is liability. You are worried he is going to relapse on the job. You are worried he will be unreliable.
You are terrified of the legal nightmare of trying to fire him if things go wrong. The friction is simply too high. It's easier to just throw the resume in the trash.
So the HR department acts as a wall.
Temps to the Rescue completely removes that wall by acting as a corporate shield.
The employer isn't taking a risk on an unknown, potentially volatile individual.
They are signing a simple business contract with the Durham Rescue Mission, which is a massive, established, highly respected entity in the city.
It's like a parent acting as a co-signer on a teenager's first apartment lease. The landlord doesn't trust the teenager, but they trust the parent's credit score.
That is a perfect analogy. The mission is co-signing on the resident's reliability.
It absorbs all the risk, creating a safe, frictionless runway for the resident to prove their worth on the factory floor.
They build a tangible work history and eventually transition into being a fully independent direct hire. It is a masterpiece of aligning corporate interests with social rehabilitation.
And we get to see the ultimate cyclical success of this model in the story of Lynn Holloway.
Lynn's story is the ideal validation of the entire system.
Lynn was a guy who was utterly consumed by the demon of severe addiction. He had lost absolutely everything to the streets.
He finally comes to the Durham Rescue Mission and claws his way through the grueling 12 months of the Victory program.
But when he graduates, the mission doesn't just pat him on the back and push him out the door.
No, they recognize his potential. They invest in him further. They sponsor him with a scholarship to attend Piedmont Baptist College.
He goes to college, gets his degree, and then, this is the best part, he comes back.
He returns to the Durham Rescue Mission, first as a Christian counselor, and eventually rises to become the director of education.
He ends up overseeing the very Victory program that saved his life in the first place.
It is the ultimate proof of concept. The consumer of the charity transforms into the provider of the charity.
It proves that the mission's massive investments aren't just about managing poverty or putting a Band-Aid on a wound.
It's about actually curing the disease and generating new hyper-empathetic leaders for the community.
But, the needs of Durham did not remain static, and neither did the mission. As the decades went on, they realized they couldn't just serve men.
The city was facing a profound crisis involving vulnerable women and children,
which introduces an entirely new, deeply complex layer of socioeconomic challenges.
When you are dealing with single mothers who are facing homelessness, the stakes are exponentially higher.
You aren't just trying to save an individual. You're trying to stabilize an entire family unit.
And the barriers to economic independence for a single mother are often incredibly steep.
To tackle this, the mission brought in Dr. Sal Nolfo, who we mentioned earlier, and his wife, Marge Nolfo.
And I have to say I love their backstory because neither of them were hired via some fancy executive search firm.
Both of them started by just showing up as volunteers. They simply put in the work and eventually became foundational pillars of the entire organization.
And Marge brings a very specific, fiercely practical skill set to the women's program.
Yes. Marge has a psychology degree, which is obviously crucial for dealing with the trauma these women face.
But she doesn't just sit in an office conducting therapy sessions. She uses her background to run a highly rigorous 12-month computer and vocational training program.
And this isn't just, here's how to turn on a laptop and send an email. This is intense.
They are getting actual marketable Microsoft Office certifications, mastering Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Access databases.
But the part that really caught my eye is that Marge makes them take comprehensive classes in medical terminology. Why medical terminology? That seems so specific.
It is brilliantly specific. It goes back to our very first point about the city of Durham.
Durham is the city of medicine.
The mission's leadership analyzed the local economy and realized that 30% of all available jobs in the city are directly or indirectly related to the medical field, hospitals, research labs, billing departments, clinics.
Oh, wow. So they aren't just giving them generic skills. They are reverse engineering the local job market.
It is hyper-local vocational alignment. They are not training these women for hypothetical jobs that exist in New York or Silicon Valley.
They are equipping them for the specific high-demand jobs that literally exist down the street.
The goal isn't just to get them a job flipping burgers. The stated goal of Marge's program is to take a woman who might otherwise be trapped in minimum wage, unskilled labor, and quite literally double her earning potential so she can afford childcare and rent.
Okay, but here's another massive hurdle. Let's say a woman graduates. She gets the Microsoft certification, she knows the medical terminology, and she lands a great job at a Duke University clinic.
She still has to physically get to the clinic every day.
And if you've ever tried to rely on public transportation in a sprawling city, especially when you have to drop kids off at daycare first, you know it is a nightmare.
A late bus means a written warning. A sick kid means you miss your shift and get fired.
You've identified the exact trap that keeps hourly workers in poverty. Reliable transportation is the absolute linchpin of upward mobility.
You can have all the skills in the world, but if you can't commute reliably, your employment is incredibly fragile.
The mission recognized this systemic failure, so they created a car program.
Now, lots of charities take donated cars, but usually they just sell them at auction to fund the charity's budget.
Right, but the Durham Rescue Mission does something different. They take these donated functioning vehicles and they sell them directly to the single mothers who are graduating from the training program.
And they sell them at massively reduced below-market prices.
They're essentially subsidizing the commute.
Yes. By ensuring these women own a reliable vehicle, the mission is protecting the massive investment they've made in her vocational training.
It removes the fragility of public transit. It's a holistic approach, treating the trauma, providing the skills, and supplying the physical tools necessary to actually survive in the modern economy.
And we really cannot gloss over the emotional trauma these women are carrying.
The text points out that many of the women arriving at the mission are dealing with severe abuse, chronic abandonment, and the crushing psychological weight of survival sex work and prostitution.
Dr. Saul Nulfo has a very poignant observation about this. He notes that these women have often desperately turned to the solutions the world offers: drugs to numb the pain, abusive partners for financial security, and found themselves spiraling further away from hope.
The program counters this by using daily biblical devotions not just as spiritual exercises, but as frameworks to teach practical life skills.
How to budget, how to raise children without repeating cycles of abuse, how to stay drug-free.
Healing the heart so the new skills actually stick. We have a beautiful story in the text that illustrates this perfectly. It's the story of Dennis and Tracy Bynum.
Both of them arrived at the mission completely shattered by their life experiences.
Dennis is quoted in the book, and you can hear the exhaustion in his voice. He says, "On the street out there, it's real cruel, it's real dangerous."
They both enter the mission, and they both successfully navigate their respective grueling recovery programs.
And during this time, they meet, and they experience what the mission officially calls biblical dating.
Biblical dating. Explain the mechanics of that, because it sounds incredibly strict.
It is very strict. It essentially means no physical touching, no holding hands, no kissing, no physical intimacy of any kind. It is purely about talking.
That sounds archaic to a modern ear. What is the psychological strategy behind that rule?
Think about the trauma histories of the people involved. If someone's past relationships were defined by physical abuse, manipulation, or transactional sex, physical touch can be incredibly distorting.
It can rush intimacy and mask deep incompatibilities.
By removing physical contact entirely, the mission forces the couple to build a relationship based exclusively on communication.
They have to talk about their shared values. They have to unpack their mutual history.
They have to build a foundation of deep platonic trust and mutual understanding before the complication of physical attachment is introduced.
For Tracy, who admitted that she had previously seen herself simply as a user, an abuser, and a victim, this slow, purely communicative process helped her realize that she had actual intrinsic worth.
Someone was interested in her mind and her soul, not just her body.
And the culmination of this methodical, respectful courtship is that Dennis and Tracy became the first residents to ever be married right there in the mission's chapel.
And the detail that just wrecks me is that Tracy did not have her biological family there to support her. Her ties were broken.
So, Gail Mills, Mama Mills, literally stood in for her mother on her wedding day.
That image perfectly encapsulates the ultimate function of the Durham Rescue Mission. It has transcended being a mere institution or a shelter.
It operates as a proxy family for thousands of people who have been entirely abandoned by their biological families and failed by the safety nets of the state. The mission steps into the breach.
They fill the void comprehensively, vocationally, spiritually, and deeply relationally.
Okay, we have spent a lot of time looking at the individual microscopic level, the daily schedules, the dating rules, the one-on-one counseling.
Let's zoom out and look at the macro impact.
Yeah.
I want to look at the sheer scale of what this organization evolved into.
Let's talk about the economics of compassion, because the output metrics of this organization are frankly staggering.
The growth from that tiny freezing building in 1974 is monumental. Let's just look at a single snapshot year. Let's look at the data from 2004.
Okay, hit me with the numbers.
In that single year, the Durham Rescue Mission provided over 58,000 nights of safe lodging. They served 183,111 hot meals.
Wow.
They distributed 200,408 items of clothing to people in need.
And when you calculate the monetary value of all the goods and services they injected directly back into the local community, it totals an estimated $3.1 million.
$3.1 million of localized economic relief. And a massive, highly visible component of that outreach is their annual back-to-school party.
Yes, this is a fascinating event. It was originally conceived in 1999, right in the immediate traumatic aftermath of the Columbine High School massacre.
The mission's leadership realized they needed a way to proactively reach out to local youth and provide a safe, positive, supportive environment before kids fell into violence or despair.
And it grew into a massive logistical operation. The text notes that in 2004, they gave out 2,300 brand new backpacks, completely filled with necessary school supplies to needy children across the city.
And they didn't do it alone. They had major help from corporate partners like Golden Corral, providing food for the thousands of attendees.
And this brings us to what might be the most socio-politically fascinating aspect of the entire Durham Rescue Mission story.
Think about the cultural landscape we live in. We have established very clearly that the mission is an unapologetically religious, highly evangelical organization.
They believe the Bible is the literal cure for addiction.
In almost any other major American city, that strong, unyielding religious identity would completely isolate them.
It would make secular corporate America incredibly nervous to partner with them, and it would likely cut them off from broad civic support.
Right. Because you usually see a massive impenetrable wall between secular, publicly traded corporations and hyper-religious charities. Companies usually want to keep their philanthropy very neutral.
Yet, when you look at the donor list for the Durham Rescue Mission, you have pharmaceutical giants, major telecommunication companies, and fierce cutthroat local business rivals all eagerly pulling out their checkbooks to fund this evangelical mission.
How? Is this purely a pragmatic calculation by these corporations? Are they just looking at the undeniable return on investment of changed lives?
That is exactly what it is. Corporations are fundamentally pragmatic entities. They look at the data.
They can look at the socioeconomic metrics of Durham, the crime rates in certain zip codes, the high school dropout rates, the visible homelessness.
And they can clearly see the local government's inability to meaningfully move the needle.
The bureaucracy is just stuck.
Then they look at the Durham Rescue Mission, and they don't just see people preaching, they see undeniable, measurable efficacy.
They see an organization that is demonstrably taking men and women off the streets, curing their chemical dependencies, equipping them with Microsoft certifications.
Acting as their employer of record to remove hiring risk and successfully placing them into the local workforce, the ROI, the return on investment, is bulletproof.
And the resulting corporate synergy is amazing to read about. You have GlaxoSmithKline, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies on the planet, stepping in.
They created a massive $250,000 scholarship endowment specifically for residents graduating the Victory program.
You have Verizon funneling money into web design grants for the residents. But honestly, my absolute favorite example of this uniting power involves the local car dealerships.
The story of the rival dealerships is incredible. It perfectly illustrates how the mission overrides normal market hostility.
If you've ever lived in a city, you know that local car dealers are brutal competitors. In Durham, you have three major players.
Jim Elkins of Elkins Chrysler Mitsubishi, Tony Fisher of University Ford, and Gene Smith of Hendricks Chevrolet.
These three guys wake up every single day fighting tooth and nail against each other for market share. They are trying to steal each other's customers constantly.
But when the Durham Rescue Mission's women's ministry put out the word that they desperately needed reliable group transportation to shuttle women to job interviews and medical appointments, the market hostility just evaporated.
These three fierce, cutthroat competitors actually picked up the phone, called each other, pooled their financial resources, and jointly purchased a brand new Dodge van for the mission.
It speaks volumes about the unifying power of undeniable competence. The mission acts as a neutral, universally respected ground where vastly different political views, religious beliefs, and corporate agendas can seamlessly converge for a single, effective cause.
And this community support mobilizes with shocking speed.
Yeah, the story of the stove fire is the perfect example of that speed.
Right. The mission has this massive commercial cooking stove that they use to feed hundreds of people every day.
One day it catches fire and is completely destroyed. The replacement cost for a piece of industrial equipment like that is $4,000, which is a massive, unexpected hit to a nonprofit budget.
A local television station runs a quick human interest story about the fire on the evening news.
And by the very next day, the response is so overwhelming that the mission literally has to start calling people back and saying, please stop sending us money. 6 different companies already offered to buy it. We have the stove.
That is not normal charitable giving. That is a community fiercely protecting an asset they know they cannot survive without.
Even the most hardened, secular, institutional veterans look at the mission and have to concede its power.
Roland Wilkins is a great example. He spent 30 years as a development veteran at Duke University, a massive, highly secular, intensely academic institution.
The absolute opposite of Ernie Mills' background.
Exactly. Wilkins looks the mission, and he explicitly admits that they are accomplishing what government agencies simply cannot do.
He notes that the mission proves what private enterprise and grassroots organizations can achieve when they decide to stop waiting for help and just bring a neighborhood together.
They aren't just operating a soup kitchen. They are actively reweaving the social fabric of the city that was lost decades ago.
So as we bring this massive journey to a close, think about the distance we've covered.
We started in a freezing, riot-torn, oil-starved Durham in the 1970s. We watched a young couple, armed with no money, no corporate backing, and failing college grades, decide to open a shelter because a book asked them what Jesus would do.
And we watched that tiny seed grow into a multi-million-dollar, fiercely effective force for community healing that enjoys the financial backing of the biggest, most pragmatic corporations in the state.
It is a profound living testament to a quote that author Andrea Higgins includes in the book. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called.
If you were building a resume for this job, Ernie and Gail Mills did not have it.
But what they lacked in academic pedigree, they made up for with sheer resilience, unshakable faith, and a radical willingness to learn by doing.
Even if learning meant taking off a wedding ring and sleeping on the cold concrete of Washington, D.C., just to understand the true weight of indignity.
For you listening right now, the takeaways from this deep dive are massive, completely, regardless of what industry you work in or what your religious beliefs are.
It is a masterclass in the transformative power of genuine empathy, the kind that forces you out of your comfort zone and into someone else's shoes.
It shows the absolute necessity of coupling profound, unyielding respect with incredibly high expectations and rigid discipline.
And most importantly, it proves the magic that happens when a community stops sitting around waiting for a top-down bureaucratic government mandate to fix its problems and starts acting like a highly functional family.
It is the ultimate proof that our most intractable, stubborn social problems, whether it's generational addiction, chronic homelessness, or systemic poverty, are not actually immune to intervention.
But the intervention cannot be sterile. It cannot be administered from a distance by people holding clipboards. It has to be deeply, messily personal.
Which brings us all the way back to that patient chart we talked about at the very beginning of the show. That neat, clean, comfortable narrative we want our cities to have.
Durham's chart is messy. It is full of contradictions.
It has the glittering high-tech brilliance of the city of medicine alongside the deep, painful scars of urban poverty. But the Durham Rescue Mission acts as the connective tissue, tirelessly working to heal the whole body.
And it leaves us with this final provocative thought to ponder as you go about your day.
In an age where we are constantly looking for massive, systemic, multi-billion-dollar bureaucratic solutions to solve poverty and addiction, does the true, lasting cure actually require something much harder? Does it require a deeply intimate, highly personal surrender, not just from the broken person asking for help, but from the comfortable community being asked to offer it?